Maryland is a state where colonial towns, Civil War battlefields, winding back roads, and quiet waterways carry secrets of the past. In this episode of 12 Unsolved, we're heading into the Old Line State to look at unresolved cases, disappearances that left families suspended in time, deaths ruled inconclusive too quickly, and investigations that stalled long before the truth was reached. These are 12 lives, 12 mysteries of Maryland. Welcome back to the Agatha May Detective Agency. I'm Agatha May, and I'm so glad you're joining me for another episode of 12 Unsolved. Paid memberships help me keep the search alive, one story, one state at a time. Thank you for helping me bring these cold cases out of the shadows. And I'll leave information on the membership options in the description box below. Our first case starts back in the winter of 1968. On Christmas Day, 1968, Bob Lewis Richard Boyd sat opening presents with his 4 siblings in their Port Republic, Maryland home. His most beloved gift that year was a pocket watch. Bobby, as he was known, was a gentle child and loved to be outdoors. So the day after Christmas, with pocket watch securely tucked in his hip pocket, he set off down the street with his pet deer, Pete, trailing behind him. When lunchtime came and went without any sign of Bobby, the family thought he was just out exploring the woods. Pete eventually showed back up to the house, but Bobby wasn't with him. And when dinner time came around and Bobby still wasn't at home, the family became alarmed. At 7:30 that evening, his parents, Jane and Richard, called police. A search began immediately, and for the next 5 days, as long as there was daylight, people were out searching the woods, creeks, and ponds. But there was no sign of Bobby and no clues as to where he'd gone. Police started looking at the family to see if one of them possibly had something to do with Bobby's disappearance. The father, Richard, is the one who was the most suspicious. He supposedly was at work the day that Bobby disappeared, but a witness said that they saw him behind a local church that day during the time he should have been working. Even more damning is that 2 days after Bobby vanished, Richard was said to have given a friend Bobby's prized pocket watch and asked the friend to hold on to it for him. It was also later discovered that Richard had once taken photos of some of the neighborhood children that should have landed him in jail. It was reported that he was also later found to have had other CSAM in his possession. Once Jane learned about the photos, she took the remaining children, left Richard, and moved to California. Not long after she moved, Richard contacted her and asked her to send the boys back to him, but let her know he didn't have any need for the girls. Jane flatly refused and kept her boys safe. Richard died in 2019 without ever being charged with anything having to do with the CSAM or with Bobby's disappearance. If you have any information in the case, please contact the Maryland State Police at 410-535-1400. On a warm summer day in June of 1975, 14-year-old Paul Lentz left his home in Rockville, Maryland, to walk to a nearby bowling alley. When he didn't return home that night, his parents filed a missing persons report with the Montgomery County Police. But the police didn't take it seriously and kept insisting that Paul was a runaway. 6 days after he disappeared, state police sent out a teletype that a road worker that was mowing the grass in a ditch in Rockville, Maryland, discovered a body. And Rockville is about 40 minutes from Paul's home. A few days later, dental records confirmed the body was Paul's. He had been stabbed to death with a hunting knife, and the weapon was recovered at the scene. I was unable to find the exact date, but shortly after Paul's death, someone broke into the Lentz home, ransacked it, and stole Paul's alarm clock, and that was the only thing that was taken. An investigation was started immediately after Paul's body was discovered. There were interviews and polygraph tests, but no persons of interest were ever named, and there has never been any arrest in connection with Paul's murder. I wonder what police would have been able to find had they started investigating as soon as Paul was reported missing. If you have any information about Paul's murder, please contact the Maryland State Police at 301-424-2101. On September 12, 1976, Baltimore County detectives discovered the body of a young woman near the Lorraine Park Cemetery in Woodlawn, Maryland. She had been heavily sedated and then was sexually assaulted and strangled. She had no identity on her and became known as Woodlawn Jane Doe. She remained unknown for 45 years until DNA evidence in 2021 finally showed that Woodlawn Jane Doe was Margaret Federoff. She was only 16 years old when she died. Margaret lived in Alexandria, Virginia, about an hour from where she was found. Her family had reported her missing in 1975 and had lived for 45 years not knowing what happened to her. Even now, while her identity is known, investigators still don't know who murdered her or how she ended up 50 miles from home. If you have any information in her case, please contact the Baltimore County Police Department at 410-887-3943. In the spring and summer of 1977, Nancy Jason, 18, was living in a house in Bethesda, Maryland, owned by a religious group called Divine Light Mission. Nancy had epilepsy, and the group claimed that their meditation technique was a cure-all for anything from headaches to cancer. On July 20th of that year, Nancy was preparing for a trip to Florida to attend a group meeting. She had laid out clothes, money, and a camera in preparation, but then disappeared, leaving her belongings behind. It was as though one minute she was there and the next she wasn't. Dr. Robert Halowitz, who was one of the doctors treating Nancy, lost his medical license in 1993 after female patients of his complained that he'd had sex with them. Now, why did a group who believed that meditation could cure them need a doctor is a question I can't answer. Dr. Halowitz told his female patients that he was the embodiment of God and was on a mission to bring love and light into the world by fathering children. Well, there's a pickup line I haven't heard until now. One of his patients reported that Dr. Halowitz told her that patients who displeased him had met untimely deaths. So did he have anything to do with Nancy's disappearance? There was another man who was under suspicion, though. An unknown man in his 30s was hanging around the house at the time, presumably to recruit members for his own religion. No one has ever identified him, but investigators would like to know who he is and possibly interview him to see if he has any information about Nancy's disappearance. And if you have any information, please contact the Montgomery County Police Department at 240-773-5086. In August of 1980, Zita Gutierrez, who was known by most as Cecilia, was working 2 jobs to pay her way as a student at Montgomery College in Rockville, Maryland. She worked at the National Institute of Health in Bethesda and had just started a second job as a cocktail waitress at the Kenwood Country Club, also in Bethesda. On August 22, 1980, she had finished her shift at the country club and then left to meet her fiancé and some friends at a local nightclub. She was supposed to pick up a friend before going to the club, but Cecilia never made it. A co-worker saw her car leaving the country club that evening at around 9:25, but couldn't verify if Cecilia was the one driving it. When she failed to pick up the friend or make it to the club, her fiancé thought that maybe her car had broken down. So he picked up the friend and they went looking for Cecilia. They were unable to find any sign of her and called police at 2 a.m. to report her missing. The next day, her Dodge Challenger was found in the parking lot of the National Institute of Health, which was in the area where she was to have picked up the friend. There was no evidence of any struggle in or around her car, but Cecilia was never heard from again. No new evidence has come to light since then that has led police to a suspect. Over 45 years, and Cecilia's case isn't much closer to being solved than it was the night that she vanished. If you have any information, please contact the Montgomery County Police at 240-777-0788. When Nancy Snow was 42, she was freshly divorced and had moved to Annapolis, Maryland, to get a new start. After only living in the area for 2 years, she was well known in town and was quite the socialite. On the night of November 5th, she flew to Baltimore to attend a party. She stayed overnight in the city, then had breakfast the next morning with the host of the party. He told authorities the last time he saw Nancy, she had gotten in the car with a man named Paul Collins, who was a family friend who would often take care of Nancy's apartment when she was out of town. Paul allegedly drove her back home, and then a few days later, Nancy disappeared. One of the stories about her disappearance is that she'd met a man who went by the name Captain J, and he offered to let her help him sail a yacht to one of the Caribbean islands. However, police were unable to ever find any record of Nancy being on a boat during that time. Paul continued to take care of Nancy's apartment and was writing checks on her account, but none of the checks or the amounts were suspicious to investigators. They were just checks for normal household costs. But according to one of Nancy's daughters, Paul began giving away Nancy's belongings. He got rid of some of her clothes, and then her car was missing. The daughter was able to locate it a year later, and it had been abandoned and it was overgrown with weeds. Paul was questioned by the police, but they could never find any evidence that he was responsible for Nancy's disappearance. Police were also unable to verify who Captain J was or even if he was a real person. If you have any information about Nancy's disappearance or possibly know the identity of Captain J, please contact the Annapolis Police Department at 410-268-9000. In the summer of 1981, 17-year-old Catherine Kitty Quackenbush and her brother had driven up from their home in Georgia to visit their father in the Del Mar area of Maryland. On July 14th, Kitty planned on going to Cherokee Bowling Lanes just north of Salisbury. She was supposed to be picked up by someone that night, and it was unclear if it was a friend or a romantic interest, but he was a little late, so Kitty started walking to the bowling alley. She was last seen walking south on Route 13 and was never seen again. She was reported missing and foul play is expected. But since her disappearance, no one has been named as a person of interest, and Kitty's case doesn't seem to be any closer to being solved than it did almost 45 years ago. If you have any information about Kitty's disappearance, please contact the Maryland State Police Department at 410-290-0500. On the afternoon of November 16, 1985, 21-year-old Leanne Falk stopped at her boyfriend's parents' house in Oxon Hill, Maryland. She was with a man named JJ, and that's all anyone seems to know about his identification, just a nickname. After Leanne and JJ left, Leanne was never seen again. Her apartment in Hyattsville, Maryland showed no forced entry, and nothing was disturbed inside. None of her belongings seemed to be missing, and even her purse was left behind. Her family reported her missing, and 10 days later, the police were investigating her case as a homicide. Leanne's sister thinks that Leanne perhaps witnessed JJ commit a crime, and he killed her because of it. But there's no mention of JJ ever being interrogated by the police, or any mention of him ever being identified. In December of 2022, there was a search in Betty Bloom Park in Oxon Hill for any clues to Leanne's disappearance, but no clue as to what happened to Leanne that autumn day in 1985 was ever found. If you have any information, please contact the Prince George's County Police at 301-352-1200. On September 27, 1986, 23-year-old Bernadette Caruso finished her day's work at Shaw's Jewelry Store in the East Point Mall in Baltimore County, Maryland, got into her 1982 Chevy Cavalier, and pulled out of the mall parking lot. That was the last time that Bernadette was ever seen. She told a coworker that she was going to meet her estranged husband, Michael, to have a talk with him, and she told another friend that she'd call her later, but that call was never made. Bernadette and Michael were going through a divorce and were in a bitter custody battle over their 3-year-old daughter. Their daughter was with relatives on the day that Bernadette disappeared. Michael was a police officer at the time and was later fired for abusing a prisoner. There were reports from friends and family that Michael often threatened Bernadette, but while he was interviewed by police at the time, he's never been arrested and never been named a suspect in Bernadette's disappearance. If you have any information about her case, please contact the Baltimore County Police Department at 410-887-3943. Allison Thresher, a 45-year-old divorced mother of 2, spent the evening of May 23, 2000, having dinner with her family. After visiting a while after the meal, she returned home and had a phone conversation with an acquaintance around 10 o'clock, and then emailed her employer at midnight. and that is the last that anyone heard from Allison. The following day, she was supposed to begin work as a copy editor for the Washington Post website. According to her family, Allison was very excited about her new venture. On May 25th of that year, the Washington Post notified Allison's family that she hadn't shown up for work for the past 2 days. Her sister reported her missing to the local police department, and they began an investigation. They discovered Allison's vehicle about a mile from her apartment, but her wallet and keys were missing. There were no clues to where Allison might have gone. Almost a year after Allison's disappearance, the investigation was changed from a missing person to a homicide, and it took 18 years before the police named a person of interest in the murder of Allison. On April 12, 2018, it was announced that Fernando Astorzaga was the person of interest, and at the time of the announcement, Fernando was in prison for sexually assaulting Allison's daughter. At 8:45 that evening, Fernando was found dead in his cell. He had committed suicide. 2 years after Allison's disappearance, a check in the amount of $647.08 was deposited into her bank account. It was a check from the Maryland Department of Human Resources and was for child support from her ex-husband. The check was deposited in the night depository box of a bank in Alexandria, Virginia, 45 minutes away, and it is unknown who deposited the check. Detectives have since received credible information that Fernando was Allison's murderer, but they still haven't been able to prove it, nor have they ever located Allison's remains. If you lived in the area at the time and might have noticed or discovered anything unusual, or if you know anything about Allison's murder, please contact the Montgomery County Police at 240-777-0788. On a warm summer evening in July of 2010, 31-year-old Arlene Twin Bird attended a party at the Brew River restaurant with Antonio Smith. They left the party and went to Antonio's apartment in Salisbury, Maryland, around 3 in the morning. Arlene was a twin, which is how she earned her nickname. She had a few different jobs after high school and finally settled in working at a barber shop and boutique named Classy Cats in Salisbury. The day after the party, Arlene's twin sister, Darlene, tried calling Arlene several times. When she couldn't contact her, she went to Antonio's apartment, and when she walked to the door, she saw a large blood trail and immediately called the police. The officers knocked on the door, and when they didn't receive an answer, they asked the apartment manager to let them in. Once inside, they found both Arlene and Antonio deceased. They had both been severely beaten, and Antonio died from asphyxiation, and Arlene had been stabbed. Despite conducting multiple interviews and questioning numerous individuals, no suspects have been named and no arrests have been made. If you have any information, please contact the Maryland State Police at 410-749-3101. February 3, 2016 was a foggy night in Germantown, Maryland. Nancy Strohmeyer was walking back and forth in front of the sidewalk of her apartment building. Pacing was a way to help her clear her mind, so when her neighbors saw her that evening, they didn't think it was out of the ordinary. But that was the last time that Nancy was ever seen. Nancy had Alzheimer's and had a caregiver who would help her with daily tasks. She wasn't comfortable leaving her apartment and would only go on outings when accompanied by her caregiver or one of her children. But that evening, she hadn't left with any of them. Her daughter had talked on the phone with her about 7 p.m., and it was 7:30 when the neighbors saw her pacing the sidewalk. Nancy's daughter had called her the next morning to check on her, but didn't receive an answer. So she drove to her mother's apartment and found her missing. Her car was still there and the bed was still made, so it looked as though she had disappeared sometime between 7:30 p.m. and bedtime. The only thing missing from her apartment were her keys. Her purse, cell phone, ID, and credit cards were still inside. Foul play isn't suspected, and after almost 10 years, it's more than likely that Nancy didn't survive the cold weather that night. If you have any information about her disappearance, please contact the Montgomery County Police Department at 240-773-5070. Another 12 cases, another 12 lives left in limbo. And as always, we'll keep watching the shadows because the truth has a way of surfacing eventually. Thank you so much for being here. Please like, comment, and share so these stories will get out to more people. I'll be back soon with Chapter 4 in the Charity B. Alice case. Until next time, Stay safe and be happy.